The winds of the north carried with them a chill that only the Starks could truly understand. That day, it wasn't just cold, it was heavy. Heavy with judgment, with the weight of names and blood and choices made too long ago. Lord Eddard Stark stood in the courtyard of Bear Island, his cloak dusted with frost, his sword ice resting against his boot. His face was stone, but his eyes held the storm. Ser Jorah Mormont knelt before him, wrists bound, jaw tight, staring into the dirt like it had answers. "This is wrong," he said under his breath. Not to plead, not to beg, but because it was. The only truth that would come out of his mouth without shame. Ned Stark didn't flinch. "You sold free men into chains, Ser Jorah. You broke the law of gods and men. For coin." Jorah lifted his head slowly. "I was desperate. House Mormont was drowning in debt. You think I did it for gold? I did it to keep our name alive." "You shamed it," Ned replied, quieter now. 1,000 other men faced the same winters, the same taxes, the same burdens. They didn't trade lives for silver, you did. Behind them, Lady Mage Mormont stood still, jaw clenched. She hadn't spoken once since Ned arrived. Her brother was guilty, she knew it. But she didn't have to like the man who would swing the sword. The truth was, Ned had no desire to execute Jorah, but this was law. And more than that, this was justice. The kind that couldn't be twisted by gold, or name, or pity. Robert had left the matter in Ned's hands, trusting his honor, knowing full well what that meant. "I gave you the choice to take the black," Ned said one last time, his voice nearly carried away by the wind. Jorah looked up at him. "I won't. Rot on that wall like my father," he said. "He left our house for that damned place and let it fall apart. Let it fall to me. And I tried, maybe I failed. But I will not die as a coward in chains." Ned's fingers tightened around the hilt of ice. "So be it." The sound of steel sliding free was like thunder across Bear Island. The greatsword gleamed despite the clouds, and all eyes were on the man who would kill a knight of Westeros. Forward. "In the name of Robert Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, I, Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, sentence you to die." Jorah didn't flinch. He closed his eyes. His last words were not a prayer, but a curse. "You'll regret this." And then ice fell. The courtyard was silent. The blood stained the snow, steaming in the cold. Mage didn't move. Her face remained frozen, carved from the same rock as the cliffs behind her. Ned gave the order to bury him with his name, not in a pit like a common criminal. Even that small mercy left a bitter taste. That night, Ned wrote the Raven's letter. To Jorah Mormont, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He didn't know what words to use. How do you tell a father you killed his only son? He simply wrote, "Ser Jorah stood in judgment today. His crimes were known. His death was swift. May the gods have mercy." The next morning, as Ned prepared to leave Bear Island, little Lyanna Mormont only, 5 years old, stood at the edge of the hall, watching him. Her tiny face was fierce, unblinking. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her glare cut deeper than ice ever could. Years later, she would remember that face. That man, the one who killed her uncle. The one who came with honor and left. With blood on the snow dot and across the narrow sea, in the hot, strange lands of Essos, a young girl named Daenerys Targaryen woke from a dream she couldn't explain. A man's voice had called to her in the darkness, "Forgive me, Khaleesi." She had never heard that word before, but she would. And without Ser Jorah Mormont at her side, her journey would begin without protection, without betrayal, without love, but also without mercy. The road to Winterfell was long and bitter. The snows came earlier than expected that year, and Ned Stark rode in silence for most of the journey, his men wisely keeping their distance. The weight of ice had never felt heavier on his back, not even when he used it on a deserter of the Night's Watch. But there was something different about this, about killing a knight, a nobleman, a son of the North. Even when the law was clear, the conscience could cloud. And it was. He thought often of Jeor Mormont, the old bear of the wall. The man had traded a lord's seat for cold stone halls and a black cloak. Ned respected him deeply. Now he had sent him news that would bury his only son. There would be no comforting words, no justifications. The sentence was passed and carried out. But somehow Ned felt no peace, only silence. When they reached the gates of Winterfell, Maester Luwin was waiting with a scroll in hand. The man's face looked drawn with concern even before a word was spoken. A raven from King's Landing. "My lord," he said, handing it over. Ned broke the seal and read the words slowly, mouth tightening with each line. Robert was demanding his return. The king's council was in chaos. Cersei was stirring dissent, and whispers of Targaryen movements in Essos were growing louder. Spies had sent word of a girl married to a Dothraki warlord, and Varys suspected the beginnings of something far larger than a wedding. The crown was panicking, and Ned felt the echo of Ser Jorah's final words creep up his spine. "You'll regret this." The very man who once sent letters back to Varys about Daenerys and her brother Viserys was now rotting in a northern grave dot without Jorah to spy. No information flowed to King's Landing about the Targaryen girl. No one would warn Robert in time. No one would stand by her side to steer her path. And across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen was already feeling the difference. In V's Dothrak, the Dothraki were celebrating her pregnancy. The Khaleesi had begun to walk differently, with more pride in her step. She spoke fewer words to her brother and more to the women of the Khalasar. But one thing gnawed at her. Viserys had not stopped speaking of ships in Westeros and reclaiming the Iron Throne. And without someone like Ser Jorah to temper him, to subtly report his instability, he remained unchecked. He insulted Khal Drogo openly, demanded his crown too early. But this time, there was no calm knight to offer an arm between sword and madness. This time, Drogo lost patience far quicker. It was the market square. Viserys, drunk and furious, stormed into the gathering, waving his sword and demanding the crown he'd been promised. Daenerys tried to speak, but Drogo silenced her with a look. Then, in front of the entire Khalasar, he stood and said something in Dothraki that chilled her blood. He would give Viserys a golden crown. But unlike in the original tale, there was no Jorah to hold her hand. No one to steady her as she watched her brother scream in terror, molten gold pouring over his skull. No one to tell her that he was no dragon, that dragons do not burn. She stood alone, tears wetting her cheeks. And when it was over, she wiped her face herself. A silence hung between her and the Dothraki from that moment forward. They began to see her not just as a bride or a gift, but as something else. Something dangerous. Without Jorah, Daenerys grew harder, faster. She learned not to rely on others. She learned how to give orders, how to watch death without blinking. And back in Winterfell, Ned prepared for the journey to King's Landing. Catelyn tried to speak with him about Jorah, but he dismissed it. "It's done," was all he said. But he saw it in her eyes, the same doubt that haunted his own. Bran was bedridden, still not waking. Robb tried to be strong. Arya trained harder. Sansa dreamed of the capital and her prince. Jon Snow prepared to ride for the Wall. And all the while, ravens whispered of movement across the sea, of a girl with silver hair, of a Khalasar on the move, but no one knew her name, not yet, and the one man who could have spoken it first was buried under northern snow, his blood long turned to ice. The ship rocked gently in the harbor, waves slapping the sides with rhythmic patience, as Varys read over the latest reports in the candlelit stillness of his chambers. The spider was usually calm, always composed. But today, there was something else in his eyes: annoyance, confusion, even Sir Jorah Mormont's reports had stopped. It had been weeks. No word. No raven, nothing. Varys rarely let emotions touch his face, but he leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers, and whispered, "Either he's been compromised, or he's dead." It was a problem. Jorah had been a crucial set of eyes on Daenerys Targaryen and her mad brother. The small council didn't know it, but much of what they whispered in their war councils relied on the former knight's observations, Daenerys' location, her influence over Drogo, and how close Viserys was to causing chaos. Now, that silence had stretched too long. Varys wasn't the only one noticing it. King Robert paced the small council chamber like a caged animal, his voice growing louder with each turn. "You're telling me the girl married the Dothraki warlord and is carrying his child, and no one knows where she is now?" Littlefinger gave his sly smile. "She's across the world, Your Grace. Dothraki don't sail, don't they?" Robert snapped, glaring. 1,000 men on horseback become 10,000 when they smell war. And if that bastard Drogo decides Westeros is worth crossing the water for, no army has ever crossed the narrow sea. "Your Grace," Grandmaster Pycelle croaked, his voice phlegmy. "And the girl is nothing. A child with silver hair. And empty titles." Robert slammed a goblet to the floor. "We said that about her father too, didn't we?" Varys watched all of it quietly. He didn't speak, not yet. Because something about this sudden break of information felt like more than just a dead informant. It felt like fate shifting its weight. In Essos, fate had already begun to twist. Without Sir Jorah at her side, Daenerys was learning quickly to trust no one. Not the Dothraki, not the maids who giggled behind her back, and certainly not the men who stared too long at her belly. When the attempt on her life came, a wine cellar with too many questions and too fine a vintage, she had no night to knock. The goblet from her hand. She had no warning. She drank. The poison didn't kill her, not at first, but it left her body broken. Fevered. For 3 nights, Daenerys drifted between fire and ice, dreams and memories, pain and rage. The Khaleesi nearly gave up on her. Viserys was dead, and with the Khaleesi dying, Drogo's men questioned the omens. But on the 4th night, she rose from her tent naked, hair tangled, skin soaked in sweat. She was alive, and something in her eyes had changed. Khal Drogo, who had sat in silence through it all, stood and walked to her without a word. He saw the fire in her and recognized it. Not a wife. Not a gift. A Khal in her own right. From that night, the Dothraki called her the Stormborn Witch. Some said she had fire in her veins. Others said death had kissed her and fled in fear, without Jorah Mormont's quiet counsel. Daenerys did not temper her rise with kindness or doubt. She leaned into strength, into whispers of destiny, into the darker parts of her own legend. She began to demand more from Drogo, more obedience, more readiness. The Iron Throne was not something to wait for. It was something to take. In King's Landing, Ned Stark had arrived and found himself trapped in a pit of snakes. The city reeked of lies. Cersei watched him with the eyes of a cat ready to pounce. Littlefinger offered smiles that meant nothing. And Robert was already too far gone in wine and regrets. But it was Varys who eventually came to him, quietly, alone. "I believe you should know something," the eunuch said. Ned narrowed his eyes. "If it's more secrets, I've had my fill." "This secret is dead," Varys replied softly. "Your execution of Sir Jorah Mormont, it may have been the most consequential act of justice in recent years." Ned frowned. "I did what had to be done." "Yes," Varys said, nodding. But he was the only voice keeping Daenerys Targaryen balanced. He was the leash on her dragons, so to speak. And now that leash has snapped, we no longer know where she is, what she plans, or who she's becoming. Ned stared at him, heart tightening. "She's just a girl." "She was just a girl," Varys corrected. "Now she's something else, and thanks to your honor, we'll all find out what that means." The night in King's Landing was alive with murmurs of war, of whispers, of plots hidden behind silk and gold. But in the chambers of the Hand of the King, Eddard Stark sat alone, his hands stained with more than just the ink of letters and royal decrees. His thoughts, always heavy, now carried a weight that no sword could lift. Daenerys Targaryen. That name, once just a whisper across the sea, was now an echo inside every chamber of the Red Keep. Varys' words haunted him. She was just a girl. Now she's something else. Ned had tried to move past it, tried to focus on Robert's children, on the truth that poisoned the crown from within. But at every turn, he was met with walls. And every time he looked at the ink-black ravens perched on the rookery, waiting to carry his words across kingdoms, he wondered if one more letter could undo what his blade had already carved in stone. What if he had let Jorah live? What if exile had been enough? But he hadn't. And now the game had changed. Across the sea, Daenerys was no longer healing, she was gathering. Her poisoning had awakened something inside her, and it wasn't mercy. As her belly grew, so did her power. Drogo, once distant and ruling from the saddle, began to consult her on matters of movement, raids, and offerings from foreign merchants. She spoke little, but when she did, the men listened. Word spread quickly through the Khalasar. The Khaleesi had survived poison. The child she carried kicked stronger than any babe. The Dothraki believed now deeply that she was chosen by something greater than gods. And in her dreams, Daenerys began to see fire. She stood before 3 dragons, wings vast and shadows longer than mountains. Sometimes they spoke in riddles, sometimes in screams. But always behind them was a voice she never could name. It wasn't Drogo. It wasn't Viserys. It was foreign, broken, full of guilt. I'm sorry. Khaleesi. When she awoke, her eyes would scan the empty tent, and her fingers would curl around the hilt of the curved Dothraki dagger she now kept under her pillow. She no longer trusted dreams. She no longer trusted fate. She only trusted power. Back in King's Landing, the council finally snapped. News had reached them that Daenerys had survived an assassination attempt, and not only survived, but was now seen as a queen among barbarians. Robert, drunk and furious, demanded her death once again. I should have sent the damn fleet years ago. What are we waiting for? Heard a fly across the sea on dragon's wings. Littlefinger chuckled, half sincere. Well, your grace, the Dothraki still don't sail. Ned stood, anger rising. Enough. She's a child with no army that can reach us. You're wasting time hunting phantoms while your own house burns. Robert turned to him, eyes bloodshot. A child? That child's womb carries a war. Her son will bear the blood of House Targaryen and the fury of the Dothraki. You think that child will grow up and ask for peace? Silence. It was in that moment that Ned realized something else, the deeper reason for Robert's rage. It wasn't just politics. It was fear. Fear of ghosts, of Rhaegar, of a crown stolen, not won. Send the assassins then, Ned said bitterly. And pray to the gods that this time you don't miss. But the council was already moving. Varys said nothing, only nodded quietly. The next day, Robert signed a writ for another attempt. This time more subtle, more final. What none of them knew was that across the sea, Daenerys was already making her first real demand. She stood before Khal Drogo, one hand on her belly, the other clenched into a fist. I want the Iron Throne, she said in broken Dothraki, for our son. You promised me stars. I want the land beneath them too. Drogo looked at her, long and quiet. Then he nodded. It wasn't about politics anymore. This was blood. Honor had ended one man's life, and in doing so, it had birthed a war. The Dothraki horde moved like a storm across the grasslands, tens of thousands of hooves pounding the earth, drums echoing like thunder in the distance. Villages emptied before them, caravans vanished into the night, and rumors spread faster. Then the horses ran. They were no longer a Khalasar bound only to Khal Drogo. They rode for a queen. Daenerys stood tall in her saddle, her hair braided with silver rings, her cloak billowing behind her like the wings she dreamed of. She had grown colder since the poisoning, stronger. The softness in her voice had faded, replaced by sharp command. There was no Jorah Mormont to urge patience, no voice of reason to say wait. Only the fire in her blood and the child inside. Her already a symbol of destiny to those who followed her. In the evenings, she sat beside Drogo in the great tent, speaking of Westeros, of the crown, of castles by the sea and swords of ice. She spoke of it not as a land across the sea but as home, a home taken from her, a home she would take back. Drogo didn't understand all her words, but he understood conquest, and he had made a vow, not just to her, but to the unborn prince he believed would conquer the world. Back in King's Landing, the air was just as tense but colder, heavier, the kind of atmosphere that clung to your skin like sickness. Eddard Stark had had enough. The city was a rot. Lies beneath gold, truth wrapped in whispers. He had uncovered the truth of Joffrey's parentage, the vile seed of Jaime Lannister, not Robert Baratheon. But every move he made felt like it was against a tide too strong to hold back. And now, there were whispers of war across the sea. Real ones, ravens from Lys, from Karth, even from the Free City spoke of Dothraki stirring. Of a Khalasar that no longer raided but conquered. Of a Targaryen girl no longer hiding. Varys came to him again, face paler than usual. She's not just alive, Lord Stark. She's moving. And she's gaining support. Ned clenched his jaw. She was supposed to be a frightened girl clinging to life in a strange land. Now she's a queen with an army, Varys said quietly. And your blade, your honor, removed the one man who kept her from becoming what she was born to be. Ned didn't respond. He stared out the window toward the city, wondering if this was what justice looked like. If taking one traitor's head had truly doomed the realm. Catelyn's letters were slower now, more cautious. Robb had grown tense in her absence. And Jon had already taken the black. Winterfell felt a world away. Robert drank harder every night, haunted by visions of dragons and old ghosts. And Cersei. She was moving too, whispering, smiling, scheming. One night, as Ned walked the halls of the Red Keep, he passed a tapestry depicting Aegon the Conqueror on Balerion the Black Dread, raining fire on Westeros. He paused and stared. For the first time, he imagined what it might look like if Daenerys rode over that same sky. No Jorah to whisper caution in her ear. No betrayal to humble her rise. Only fury. Only fire. In Essos, Daenerys stood on a high cliff beside Drogo, overlooking a foreign harbor. Ships docked below, bribed or taken by blood. They would begin preparations soon. Westeros will fear you, one of the Blood Riders said in the common tongue. Daenerys didn't blink. They already should. When the sea wind blew across her face, she smiled, but it wasn't soft. It wasn't innocent. The girl was gone. What rose in her place was something far more dangerous. A queen forged by fire. Loss, betrayal, and absence. The absence of a single man who might have warned her that vengeance burns hotter than justice. But Sir Jorah Mormont was long dead, and his silence had become her voice. The ocean stretched endless and black beneath the moonlight, waves glinting like polished obsidian. From the deck of the lead ship, Daenerys Targaryen stared into the distance, her silver blonde hair whipping in the wind. Behind her, the Dothraki murmured in unfamiliar tongues, uneasy on the wooden vessels. They were not born for ships. They were born for blood and land. But they followed her still. She had done the impossible. Convinced them to sail. Convinced the horse lords to place their trust in waves instead of plains. Not through diplomacy. Not through tradition, not through fear. There was no more hesitation in her. No more need for gentle guidance or soft truths. Every step she took now was carved in certainty and vengeance. Jorah Mormont would have tried to slow her, to counsel patience. But Jorah was gone, buried under northern snow, and with him, any trace of restraint. She walked the deck barefoot, stepping past blood riders sharpening their blades, past foreign captains giving her wary glances. To them, she was a child queen. To her people, she was a living prophecy. In her hand, she carried an old Valyrian scroll given to her in Karth, one she barely understood, but clung to like scripture. It spoke of fire reborn, of dragons rising in times of great shadow. The dragons, still locked in their heavy iron cage below deck, sensed her power growing. They snapped and hissed even in sleep. They were hungry, just like her. Across the sea, in King's Landing, the skies grew heavier with each passing day. Rain fell more often now, as if the gods themselves sensed the approach of something unnatural. Eddard Stark no longer walked the Red Keep with the same quiet dignity. He moved like a man drowning in time racing to fix a kingdom already bleeding. The plan to expose the truth about Joffrey had stalled. Robert was rarely sober. Cersei had grown bolder. And Littlefinger was spinning his own web, thick with promises and poison. Ned barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of ice, of the moment it sliced through Jorah Mormont's neck, of the look in the man's eyes, shame, yes, but also fury. As if he'd taken something from the world that could never be returned. The dream always ended the same. Fire on the horizon. Screams. Wings. One evening, Varys appeared again, more urgent than ever. She's crossed the sea, he said. We have confirmation. Daenerys Targaryen sails toward Westeros with over 10,000 Dothraki. Ned stood still. She has ships? He asked, disbelieving. How? Gold from Karth, support from old Targaryen loyalists. Rumors even say pirates have offered her safe passage. Ned shook his head. They wouldn't follow a foreign girl. She's not foreign anymore, Varys replied. She is myth now. Fire reborn. And your act of justice, your execution, gave her the rage she needed to become that. Robert didn't take the news well. Let her come, he roared, flinging goblets against the wall. Let her bring her savages and her bastard dragons. I'll mount her head on the walls of King's Landing before she even sets foot. But there was fear in his eyes. He had always feared the Targaryens. He feared Rhaegar's ghost most of all. That night, Ned finally wrote to Winterfell. He told Catelyn everything. Girl was coming, that a war was rising, that Jon Snow must be warned, that the North must be ready, that he may not return. And though he didn't write it, though he couldn't bring himself to, he wondered if this was his fault. If the sword he swung on Bear Island had set fire to the world. The next morning, ravens flew in every direction, but not all of them reached their destination. Some were intercepted by those who knew Daenerys was coming and who wanted her to burn brighter. Among them, a faceless man in a dark hood, watching from the docks at Sunspear, passed the letter to a masked courier with a smile. Let the fire come, he said. This realm has rotted too long in peace. It needs cleansing. Meanwhile, the ships drew closer to Westeros, and Daenerys stood at the bow, her eyes fixed on the misty shape of the distant land rising from the sea, a land that had murdered her family, betrayed her blood, and taken everything from her. It would burn. All of it. And this time, there was no one left to tell her not to. The salt wind struck Daenerys like a slap as her fleet finally breached Westeros' rocky coastline. The ships creaked and groaned beneath the weight of war, and the Dothraki, tired, restless, sick from days at sea, stood still at the edge of the decks, silent for once. Before them rose a land shrouded in fog and myth, the birthplace of kings and slaughter, the graveyard of her family. Westeros. Honor. Wes had never set foot on it, but it already felt like hers. When her boots hit the wet sand, she didn't hesitate. She didn't kneel. She let her feet sink into the mud like roots, planting herself. The dragons hissed below deck, sensing it. She felt them tugging at her soul, now wilder by the day. She had stopped being afraid of them. She was becoming them. The first fires began that very night. The local fishing village refused to kneel. They had heard tales of Dothraki, of a silver-haired witch queen. They locked their doors and prayed to the seven. Daenerys didn't issue a second warning. Drogo gave the order, and her bloodriders obeyed with brutal precision. Screams lit up the shoreline as huts were set ablaze, and terrified survivors ran toward the woods. Dany stood on the hill watching it all, her face unreadable. Her hands clasped around her swelling belly. "No more mercy," she whispered to herself. "They showed none to my house." It was only the beginning. Farther inland, word of her landing spread like wildfire. First, to petty lords who dismissed the stories. Then, to major houses who grew uneasy. The Dothraki were not supposed to cross the sea. Dragons were supposed to be dead. But now, Westeros stood on the edge of something ancient. In King's Landing, the court was unraveling. Robert Baratheon's health had worsened. Wine no longer dulled the fear. Every report brought darker news: villages razed, banners burned, small folk running southward. There were no clear demands, no envoys sent. Daenerys had not come to talk. She had come to conquer. She wants revenge, Ned said in the council chamber. This isn't a war, it's judgment. She wants blood, Cersei replied, smiling. Let her have yours first. The Lannisters were already gathering their forces. Tywin had sent a raven from Casterly Rock. He would not wait for a dragon to arrive at his doorstep. Jaime sharpened his sword. The Golden Lions had chosen their side, and it wasn't the crowns. Robert clutched his chest in pain as he tried to speak. We need to strike her down before she grows too strong. We already missed that chance, Ned said bitterly. The court fell to shouting again. Plans were tossed like bones to dogs. Ned stood apart, his eyes distant. He kept thinking of the wall, of Jon, of the last letter he'd sent to Winterfell. He had not heard back. But the truth was, Winterfell may never see that raven, because someone else had begun to move, someone who lived in shadows. In Braavos, a whisper reached the House of Black and White. A girl with no name received a name once more. Daenerys Targaryen. A contract, sealed in blood, carried across the sea with Lannister gold. And so, a faceless assassin boarded a ship bound for the western coast, cloaked in silence, death in their pocket. But even that would not be enough, because Daenerys was not the girl she once was. The poison had forged her. The death of Ser Jorah, the man who might have softened her path, who might have reminded her of her humanity, had sealed it. In his absence, she had chosen flame over forgiveness, power over patience. Her army was growing. Old Targaryen loyalists forgotten. Men, exiled nobles, ex-mesters, hedge knights who still whispered the words. Blood and fire were now riding beneath her banner, and from the caves near Dragonstone, the dragons were finally unchained. When Daenerys walked among them, they bowed their necks low, no longer beasts but weapons awaiting her voice. She had returned not as a savior, but as a reckoning. And in the north, under the cold watch of the wall, Jon Snow stood atop the battlements, wind battering his cloak. A raven landed near his feet, scroll tied tight. He unrolled it. His eyes scanned the words. His face turned pale. The fire is coming, and this time, winter might not be enough to stop it. Smoke rose from the riverlands like a dark prayer, curling into the sky as villages burned in the path of Daenerys Targaryen's vengeance. The Dothraki rode with savage glee, their bloodlust unchained after years of crossing dry grasslands and endless sea. But this war wasn't theirs. It was hers, and her message was clear. Westeros had murdered her family, stolen her throne, and forced her into exile. Now it would kneel in ash or not at all. On the blackened plains outside Harrenhal, her dragons circled in the sky like shadows of old gods. The castle, once a symbol of defiance against Targaryens, now stood like a fossil of pride, crumbling beneath the weight of its own cursed past. It was here she made camp, raising the three-headed dragon banner on the same ground Aegon, the Conqueror, had scorched centuries ago. History, she believed, had returned home. Inside the Great Hall, she listened to whispers from her followers: Targaryen, loyalists, old Valyrian scholars, blood-soaked Dothraki leaders, and deserters from Westerosi armies. All spoke with awe. All called her queen, and none dared speak of mercy. That word had vanished from her vocabulary that night. Daenerys stood alone in the chamber, once blackened by dragonfire, gazing at a map of Westeros etched into stone. She placed a hand over King's Landing, fingers tight with rage. "You will burn," she whispered, "and you'll remember the name I carry." Far away, in Winterfell, Jon Snow read the third Raven in as many weeks, each worse than the last. First, Daenerys had landed. Second, her army had doubled. Now, she had taken Harrenhal, with dragons. He stood by the hearth in the Great Hall, firelight flickering in his eyes. The northern lords were gathered, Robb beside him, Catelyn behind, quiet and afraid. "She's not here to negotiate," Jon said. "She's here to punish." Robb clenched his fists. "Let her try. We'll remind her the North is not hers to claim." Jon turned to him slowly. "It is, Robb. We're part of the realm that betrayed her. We followed Robert. We fought under his banner. And we executed the last man who might have tempered her fire." Robb's voice dropped. "You mean Ser Jorah?" Jon nodded once. "We all knew what he did, selling men into slavery. But his death gave her nothing but silence. And in that silence, she grew colder." Catelyn spoke then, softly. "She's her father's daughter." "No," Jon said. "She's worse. Her father was mad. She's calculated." In King's Landing, the storm finally reached the gates. Daenerys gave the city one day. One chance. She sent no envoy, only a rider with a single message: kneel and live, resist and burn. The small council erupted into panic. Robert, bloated and barely able to stand, barked orders no one followed. Cersei had already begun packing her jewels. The Lannisters were ready to abandon the city if need be. The Red Keep could not stand against dragons, and Ned Stark, torn between his duty and his doom, made his final stand. He took the message himself to Robert's chambers. "You have to surrender," Ned said, voice low. "Send word to Dragonstone. Offer her the crown. Make peace while we still can." Robert looked at him with glassy eyes. "You really want to give the 7 kingdoms back to a girl?" "No," Ned said, voice sharper now. "I want to keep them alive." But Robert wouldn't listen, and the next dawn, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion blotted out the sun. The bells of King's Landing rang not in surrender, but in terror. And Daenerys, sitting astride Drogon, remembered every name that had cursed her. Family, every scream from the sack of King's Landing when the usurper took the throne. Every child who died in exile because a kingdom feared her bloodline. She gave no command. She only leaned forward and Drogon breathed. Flames fell like divine judgment. The Red Keep cracked under heat not felt in a century. The slums were reduced to ash. The gold cloaks threw down their swords and ran screaming through the smoke. Civilians screamed her name not as a prayer, but as a warning. In the throne room, Robert died with wine on his lips and fear in his eyes. Cersei never made it to her ship. And Ned Stark stood before the Iron Throne, bleeding from a broken shoulder, blade in hand, as the great doors burst open and the Queen of Fire stepped into the hall. Her face was calm, eyes dead. Behind her, the dragons waited in the rubble. "I warned you," she said. And Ned finally understood. He hadn't just executed a man on Bear Island. He had executed the only soul who could have reminded her she was still human. He lowered his sword and knelt. She did not smile, only stepped past him, toward the throne of blades and betrayal, and sat. Queen at last. Not through mercy, but through fire. And in the north, snow began to fall, but this time it fell on a land already burned.